It's June 10th, 1973, and you're headed to see the Grateful Dead at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C. You'll soon be joined by 100,000 other Deadheads grooving to the music. Everyone around you is trying to guess which song they'll open with, what covers will they do, and how long will it be before the show is bootlegged and available. 2 sensory assaults await. The first is the Dead's brand new live PA system, the largest speaker setup the world has ever seen. Rumors are that it has nearly 30,000 watts driving close to 600 speakers, and it's supposed to be the loudest, clearest, cleanest sounding concert setup the universe has ever known. It is going to be amazing. The second sensory experience will come as a blot on a little piece of paper, or maybe a sugar cube. Or maybe someone will administer a little drop directly into your mouth. A little bit of LSD always helps enhance the whole Grateful Dead experience. The audio gear was completely legal. The acid for the fans in the crowd was obviously not. But incredibly, the same person responsible for the PA system is also the person responsible for that hit of LSD. Both came from the mind of a guy everyone knew as Bear, who carried the honorific among fans, the patron of thought. He was an audio engineer and a chemist. Bands wanted him to run their gear. The cops wanted to bust him for his acid, which he manufactured at least half a kilo's worth, which was good for at least 5 million doses. I'm Alan Cross, and this is episode 54 of Uncharted Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. And this is the wild story of the one and only Owsley Stanley, and how his illegal trade in LSD changed music forever. There's the Grateful Dead from that show at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C. on June 10th, 1973. If you were in the crowd, you heard it through the wall of sound PA system. And you may have heard it, well, in an altered state, thanks to a tab of acid. And both came from the same place, Owsley Stanley III. If we're going to understand this story, we have to follow 3 different threads. Let's start with the concept of making quiet music louder for big crowds of music fans. For centuries, the only way for more people to hear music or singing over a large area was to play harder or sing louder. The only way to augment this was through architecture. The ancient Greeks and Romans built amphitheaters that carried sound further. In the Middle Ages, grand concert halls were built with careful attention paid to the acoustic properties of the buildings. When it came to popular entertainment like vaudeville, we had belters, people who could sing so loud that they could be heard clearly in the back row of the upper balconies. That was fine, but that style of singing wasn't exactly subtle. Quiet, breathy singing could only be heard in small rooms with few people. The first step toward the modern concert PA system came in 1906 when the American inventor Lee DeForest invented what he called the Audion, also known as the vacuum tube. It could miraculously take an electric signal and make it stronger. It could amplify it. People worked with vacuum tubes to see what they could do. Another couple of inventors from California, Edward Jensen and Peter Pridham, took up the cause. Actually, the first thing they did was invent feedback when they connected a microphone taken from a telephone and connected it to a speaker and a 12-volt battery. The squeal was tremendous. After more work, they were able to mount a speaker on top of their lab over which a voice could be heard a mile away. After 5 years of experiments, they unveiled the first electric public address system. It was December 24th, 1915, outside San Francisco City Hall. They called it the Magnavox system, which is Latin for great voice, and it had all of 10 watts of power. But it was enough to broadcast speeches and Christmas songs to 100,000 people. Well, some of them anyway. Other companies got involved. Tannoy, Marconi, Western Electric, Altic Lansing, Bell Labs. And before long, these contraptions with their horn-shaped speakers were being used on both sides of the Atlantic. When it came to live musical performances, These new PA systems were used just for voice. Voices were easy to amplify because they didn't take much power. Even the biggest amps back then could muster maybe 20 watts. Then they'd overheat, blow out the vacuum tubes, and die. When talking pictures came along, movie theaters needed PA systems, and the technology improved. But it wasn't until the transistor was invented in 1947 that the hot, fragile, power-hungry vacuum tubes were doomed. Not only did they run cooler, they could generate more power for amplifiers, and they were also far, far more reliable. The growth of rock music pushed things even further. First, this was music that was designed to be played loud, and it had to be played loud over big, noisy crowds. But these early PA systems were tiny, underpowered junk. They were no match for the wild crowds of screaming kids who came to see early rockers like Elvis, Little Richard, and Chuck Berry. But that's all the marketplace could provide. There were no such things as proper concert sound systems back then. Most people had just a combination mixer amp powering two PA columns on either side of the stage, each containing two 12-inch speakers. The columns weren't much bigger than standard guitar amps, and frankly, they weren't very loud, or clear, or accurate. But this wasn't just a problem for bands playing in clubs. When the Beatles played Shea Stadium in August 1965, there was still no concert sound. They set up on a small stage in the infield and used a bunch of mics and a couple of 100-watt Vox amps. Everything was then pumped through the stadium's public address system, so the same speakers announcers used to tell you who was coming up to bat was also broadcasting the music. Not only could the crowd not hear the Beatles couldn't hear themselves. As a last-second fix, one of their road crews flipped some of their amps and pointed them directly at the band, and that was the only way they could make it through the show. It was a terrible experience, and the Beatles hated it. A year later, they played their last proper live gig and never toured again. Clearly, with rock crowds getting bigger and the demands of playing bigger venues, something had to be done about the sound at concerts. But to make that work, you had to take a relatively quiet sound on a stage and then amplify it so that hundreds of thousands of people could hear the music. This has to be done with maximum realism and minimal distortion, and that can be a very hard engineering problem. The Beach Boys tried to do something about it. In 1963, they put in a call to Sun Electronics and asked them if they could create something for their live shows. And they did. And the Beach Boys system has gone down in history as the first large-scale sound system for a rock concert environment. Shortly after that, Herb Alpert, the A in A&M Records and a musician in his own right, contacted a company called Harry McCoon Sound Systems to build something for a 1965 tour. But that was about it. Most makers of PA equipment weren't into this loud concert stuff. They were very traditional, very conservative. If you wanted something for your jazz club, okay, sure. If you needed something for your country combo, they'd do that. And if the gospel singers from your church needed a little extra power, they were right there. Some manufacturers even built something into their warranties. Do not turn the volume up past this level. If you do, you will wreck the equipment and you will void the warranty. But as they say, you can't stop rock and roll. Concerts were becoming big business, and promoters needed robust sound reinforcement. The first truly massive event requiring a big sound system was the Monterey International Pop Festival in San Francisco in 1967. It was ugly and it sounded awful. What could you expect by a random conglomeration of speaker cabinets and mismatched amplifiers? But it was a start. And recognizing that there was money to be made in concert sound, people took up the challenge. One of those people was Bill Handley, who has gone down in history as the father of live sound. He got his first taste of the PA bug working for Lyndon Johnson's presidential campaign in 1965. He also did sound for Richard Nixon's campaigns in 1968. But then came the summer of 1969. The organizers of a multi-day festival called Woodstock needed a PA, so they called Handley. Using all the tricks he learned from working with Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, he was able to supply sound for about 600,000 hippies. Better, but still not good enough. The power problem was being solved, but sheer volume wasn't enough. There were issues of realism and distortion, but in most cases the solution was Just add enough speakers and amps to make it loud enough so no one will care. But there were artists like Frank Zappa, the Eagles, Carlos Santana, and the Grateful Dead who would have none of these sorts of compromises. They demanded when they played live, they actually had to sound good. By 1972, the Grateful Dead was playing in front of tens and tens of thousands of people and were very concerned that their live performances, a major part of the band's appeal, was being compromised by the sad sound reinforcement systems of the day. They'd been using a setup created by a guy named Rob Hiles since 1968, based on some Altec-Lansing voice of the theater speakers and some nifty innovations with radio horns, ring tweeters, and proper crossovers. But they'd outgrown that and knew that they needed something better. This is where we first encounter Augustus Owsley Stanley. He was already known to the Grateful Dead. He'd not only invested money in the band, but he'd worked with them as their first sound guy starting in 1965. His buddy, Bob Thomas, was brought in to create the famous Grateful Dead skull and lightning bolt logo. But back to Owsley. Almost from the very beginning, he recorded Dead rehearsals and performances, creating what he called sonic journals. He used these tapes to improve his skills as a sound engineer. The band also used them for self-critiques so they could become better musicians. Another thing, Owsley suffered a swimming pool diving accident when he was 19, something that impaired his hearing in one ear. Making these tapes helped fine-tune whatever hearing he had left. Owsley was very respected by other bands too. Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, Johnny Cash, Carlos Santana, Janis Joplin, even Johnny Cash and Miles Davis. The guy knew his way around a soundboard and how to get the best out of whatever PA gear was available. When he needed gear that didn't exist, he and his partner Tim Scully built their own. But sound reinforcement gear wasn't the only thing Owsley made. That part of the story is coming next. Humans have been looking to get high for thousands of years. Archaeologists point to ancient cave paintings all over the world that seem to show the same geographic shapes and images. The theories are that these early humans ate or smoked something, got really high, and then tried to capture what they experienced with cave paintings. We see this in paintings more than 60,000 years old. Over the eons, humans discovered alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and all manner of opium. The earliest recorded example of a drug trade dates to 1000 BC around the Mediterranean. The Assyrians called the poppy the happy plant, after they learned to use its resin. Tombs of Egyptian pharaohs had stashes. Mescaline, derived from the peyote cactus, was probably the first hallucinogenic drug discovered, along with psilocybin from mushrooms. Although it is possible that some ancient humans had discovered that they could go for a trip by licking certain species of toads, but we'll leave that aside. Psychedelic drugs are a subclass of hallucinogens that result in altered mental states. People have been tripping for centuries, and not just voluntarily. If ergot, a type of fungus, gets into a supply of grain and people or cattle eat that grain, they may suffer from ergotism. In low doses, there may be powerful hallucinations. In larger doses, it killed in terrible ways. This condition was known as St. Anthony's Fire, and 1,000 years ago, there were actually hospitals in Europe dedicated to treating victims of this. Fast forward to the 1930s. Albert Hofmann was a chemist working in the pharmaceutical division of Sandoz Labs in Basel, Switzerland. His job was to come up with new drugs. He became interested in ergot and thought there might be something he could do with it, if only he could purify it sufficiently. On November 16, 1968, he synthesized a new chemical from ergot that he thought would make a good stimulant for both the respiratory and circulatory systems. It didn't work, so he put it aside. Then, 5 years later, April 16, 1943, he thought he'd give it another go. But he didn't take all the necessary lab precautions, and a small amount of this new chemical was absorbed through his skin. He later wrote this: "I was affected by a remarkable restlessness, combined with a slight dizziness. At home, I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I found the daylight to be unpleasantly glaring. I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscope play of colors. After 2 hours, this condition faded away. Hoffman had taken the very first acid trip. Interesting, he thought. Then, 3 days later, on April 19th, he deliberately ingested some of this new chemical. He didn't know it at the time, but he took 10 times more than what turned out to be necessary, 250 micrograms. And 2 hours later, he rode his bike home. Then the drug kicked in, and I quote Dr. Hoffman, "Little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in colored fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in constant flux." The drug was lysergic acid diethylenamide, LSD for short. And this ride home on April 19th, 1943, is now known as Bicycle Day. It's a psychedelic holiday of sorts, marking the start of the psychedelic revolution. People still get high and ride a bike, sometimes in a parade with other enthusiasts on April 19th. For the next 20 years, LSD was the subject of much scholarly research, with Sandoz making LSD in its Swiss labs, and it was totally legal. LSD was used in psychiatry and seemed to offer a lot of promise. Time magazine wrote at least 6 glowing articles about this pharmacological breakthrough in the 1950s. Could it be a cure for certain mental illnesses? Could it be used to enhance creativity? Everyone was experimenting with LSD in the 50s, including, believe it or not, Alcoholics Anonymous. In one medically supervised study, LSD was given to a group of drinkers, and 50% of them reported never touching another drop of booze again. There were over 1,000 papers written on the drug. There were 6 international conferences on the drug, and it was prescribed to over 40,000 patients in conjunction with psychotherapy. And, of course, the military-industrial complex was interested. You may have heard about the CIA's MK Ultra program. They were interested in using LSD for brainwashing and psychological torture. Some of those clandestine tests were done in Canada, specifically in Montreal. Dig deep enough, and you'll find stories about how Leonard Cohen was involved. Depending on whom you ask, he was employed by the CIA or the Mossad, or both, or maybe he was just an unwitting subject. Meanwhile, LSD use leaked out into society at large. Again, it was not illegal all through the 50s and early 1960s. Some enterprising hippie chemists learned to make LSD themselves. Gangs like the Hells Angels got into the business of trafficking in LSD. And then there were the LSD enthusiasts who believed that this was a wonder drug of sorts and worked hard to promote the use of acid. The most popular of these fan clubs was the Merry Pranksters, led by author Ken Kesey, the man who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He organized dozens of parties where people could try out LSD, moving from city to city on a brightly colored bus. He called these acid tests. A favorite tactic was to coordinate something with a concert. For example, for 3 days in January 1966, there were concerts at the Longshoremen's Hall in San Francisco, with between 3,000 and 5,000 people each night. Most, if not all of them, were tripping at the same time. And the headliner those nights? The Grateful Dead. By this time, the U.S. government was growing concerned. All these hippies and their weird drugs were already on the radar. But LSD was new, and there were all kinds of stories about people having psychotic breaks and bad trips and jumping off buildings because they thought they could fly. People read about this in Life magazine and the New York Times and Time magazine and other publications. Were they true or just scare tactics, made up things? It's still unclear, but there was certainly building hysteria around any recreational drug. California was the first territory to make LSD illegal in October 1966. It became a federal Class I drug in the United States in 1968, and the United Nations added it to its list of controlled substances in 1971. This created a problem for young people who enjoyed the mind-expanding capabilities of LSD. You could still get some, but you risked ingesting something bad, impure, and dangerous. If only there was someone who could be trusted to whip up batches on the sly that were safe to use. And here's again where we encounter Augustus Owsley Stanley III and his second job that went along with doing sound for the dead. The result was legendary. It transformed music forever. And it was completely illegal. Now that we've traced the story of both concert PA systems and LSD, we can talk about how both came together thanks to Augustus Owsley Stanley III, the man who earned the title the Johnny Appleseed of LSD. His grandfather was a former congressman from Kentucky who helped pass some very important anti-monopolistic laws in Washington. Later, he became the governor of his home state. He was a progressive sort, against things like prohibition. Then again, he was from Kentucky, the home of bourbon. His son, Augustus Owsley II, wasn't nearly as famous. Working as a lawyer, he enlisted in the Navy, where he had some terribly traumatic experiences. His marriage ended in divorce, leaving his ex-wife and 2 sons, including our guy, Augustus Owsley Stanley III. He was a bright kid, allegedly teaching himself to read by the time he was 3 by studying comic books. Yet he was a terrible student and a difficult kid. He shuttled between his mother and his father and managed to get expelled from a military academy because of his bad attitude and the fact that he was able to smuggle booze into the campus. It was allegedly enough to get the entire student body drunk one night. In 1950, at the age of 15, he was admitted to the psychiatric ward of a hospital in Washington, D.C., where he underwent all sorts of therapy, none of which he says stuck. When he was released, he went to live with his father and stepmother. Dropping out of high school, Owsley was bright enough to be admitted to the School of Engineering at the University of Virginia, but he bailed on that after his first year. That caused a schism with his father, so he went to live with his grandmother. It was then, at the age of 19, he had that diving accident, which caused that middle ear hemorrhage. This, he says, was transformative. It was my right ear, and it did something to my hearing. Both ears have an entirely different character. All the highs would come in through my left ear, which is connected to the right brain, which is where most art and creativity come from. So I've been developing my right brain since I was 19. This unbalanced hearing would eventually affect the way he'd work as a sound man and as a recording engineer. Owsley found work as a rocket test engineer for a defense contractor in Los Angeles that was making intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons. A move to the Air Force had him working in the Mojave Desert, where he taught himself electronics. After that came stints working at various radio and TV stations in the Los Angeles area, working on broadcasting and sound gear. He became a fan of ballet and took dance lessons. He married a woman on a whim in Tijuana, which resulted in a son named Peter. There was another marriage, which produced a daughter, and he was arrested in Florida for writing bad checks. So here's Owsley in 1963. 2 divorces, 2 children, multiple failed careers, and a reputation as a real weirdo. He just didn't seem to fit in anywhere in society. In 1964, he moved to Berkeley, California to go to university. He moved into a rooming house with a bunch of other misfit students, and for the first time, Owsley started smoking weed. And he liked it. A lot. And he got an idea. There was obviously a huge market for dope. How could he tap into this growing demand? He somehow acquired some seeds for a variety of morning glory, the flower that you find in your garden, called heavenly blue, which happened to contain a chemical similar to what is found in LSD. Owsley put up little signs all over the campus offering 250 seeds for sale for $1. This led to trading seeds for speed. Methadone became his thing. He started making a very good buck selling the speed to students and bikers. All deals in cash, of course. Dropping out again, he got a job as a technician at one of San Francisco's biggest TV stations, while still dealing his heavenly blue seeds on the side. One day, he ran into a chemistry major named Melissa Cargill, who wanted to become a researcher, a serious scientist. They hit it off and moved in together with some other people in a house that became known as the Green Factory. It was there Owsley took acid for the first time. Medical-grade stuff, legal stuff, imported from legal factories in either Switzerland or Czechoslovakia. He loved the experience and wanted more. But getting more was next to impossible. Now, wait a second. He was technically minded. His girlfriend was a trained chemist. She also enjoyed her first LSD experience. So, using her access to the science libraries at the University of California at Berkeley, they learned on their own how to synthesize high-quality LSD. In fact, their acid was so reliably pure, it was better than the medical-grade stuff coming out of Europe. This was remarkable, given that LSD is a pretty fragile molecule that can be destroyed by something as simple as tap water that's been treated with chlorine. Setting up a lab in the bathroom of the Green Factory, Owsley and Melissa went to work. There was one police raid, but cops didn't know what they were looking for, so nobody was arrested. And get this, Owsley and Melissa had no trouble acquiring all the chemicals they needed legally. On one occasion, he wrote to a medical supply house on fake stationery for his Bear Research Group, asking to purchase a sample of pure methadone so he could conduct research on its effect on rats. That was a lie, of course, but he was sent about a pound of methadone for free on the condition that if his non-existent study got funded, this company would be his sole supplier. And so Owsley and Melissa were able to supply speed freaks with the best stuff they'd ever had. But there was a raid on the house, and so much for that enterprise. It was time to go somewhere else and maybe switch specialties. So Owsley and Melissa moved to Los Angeles, where they continued their experiments on synthesizing LSD. They rented a 2-bedroom home and ordered more chemicals from some medical supply companies. And Owsley swore on his mother's grave that the supplies would be used only for research purposes. The first shipment arrived on March 30th, 1965. By May, he and Melissa had succeeded in creating batches of the most potent LSD found anywhere on the planet. Selling it was easy. He took orders through the mail. Word got around fast about how good Owsley acid was. Profits were invested in more raw materials and lab equipment, and he increasingly got high on his own supply. He honestly believed that LSD was opening his mind to whole new universes. The money rolled in. It's unclear how many doses were manufactured in that house, but 800,000 seems to be a good number. Half were given away for free, leaving Owsley 400,000 doses to sell at $3 each. So that's a net of $1.2 million. In the fall of 1965, Owsley finally met Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters. They were very impressed by the quality of Owsley's LSD, which only increased his customer base. And it was through Kesey that Owsley hooked up with the Hells Angels again, who were anxious to distribute his product. The merry pranksters were also part of getting Owsley's LSD to all those music fans who turned up to see the Grateful Dead at the Longshoremen's Hall in January 1966. They'd heard about the man with the legendary LSD formula and had even tried his stuff, and they really, really liked it. Owsley loved the Grateful Dead right back. They offered him the job as their manager, but that wasn't his thing, so he turned it down. But he did find a guy named Rock Scully to take the gig. Owsley became something of a coach and motivator to the Grateful Dead. He encouraged them to rehearse and to become adept at improvisation. And he told them that if they were to succeed, they had to have the best possible equipment. Owsley knew what he was talking about. By this time, he'd become a serious audiophile. With all the money he earned from selling speed and acid, he'd purchased a massive audio system for his house, literally the best you could buy in the middle 1960s. Alta-glancing speaker systems meant for movie theaters, state-of-the-art Macintosh amplifiers, tape decks, microphones. It was all very impressive. He wanted the Dead to sound as great as his home stereo when they played live, so he invested his own money buying the band great gear without expecting to be repaid. By bankrolling the Dead in this way, the group was able to expand their audience reach in ways that wouldn't have otherwise been possible. When the Dead decided to move to LA, Owsley rented a house for everyone. Owsley had the top floor where he lived and worked. And this is when he acquired the nickname Bear, because of the weird noises that came from the top floor when he was having sex. The Dead and various hangers-on had the rest of the place. It was also the band's rehearsal space, and one of the first things Owsley did was buy the band some really expensive microphones so he could get proper recordings of the band's jam sessions. He encouraged them to listen back to those rehearsals, forcing them to get better. He also lent his home stereo to the band for PA purposes at gigs, and eventually, the Dead became as perfectionist as their acid-dealing friend when it came to their live sound. The LA stay lasted 6 weeks before the Dead decided they needed to go back to San Francisco. Owsley had promised not to make any LSD while he was working for them. The band didn't need the law coming down on them again, but he broke that promise when he ran out of money. He started selling some purple pills called Blue Cheer. The Dead found out, and that's why they moved back north. But Owsley followed them and ended up living with the Dead again. He was still doing sound for the band, but the gear he used never quite worked properly in a live setting. Eventually, Owsley was fired from his soundman duties. But that was okay because it just meant that he had more time to spend making LSD. The problem, though, was that LSD had been declared illegal in California on October 6, 1966. That same day, the LA Times published a story under the headline, "Mr. LSD Makes Millions Without Breaking the Law." It was a front-page story on Owsley Stanley. 2 days later, the San Francisco Chronicle reprinted the story under the title, "Homemade Drugs, The Strange Story of Bay Area's LSD Millionaire." And together, those stories cemented the legacy of Owsley Stanley. The Grateful Dead were so impressed that they wrote a song. It was called "Alive D Millionaire." Owsley only got more famous. He's mentioned by the Jefferson Airplane in a song called "Mexico." He's referenced in "Who Needs the Peace Corps," a song by Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. And if you go to the Steely Dan song "Kid Charlemagne," it was inspired in large part by Owsley Stanley. He and Melissa continued their work in a house in Port Richmond, not far from Grateful Dead headquarters. Working alongside their buddy Tim Scully, they manufactured more than 300,000 tablets of very powerful acid, which were liberally distributed at an event called Powwow, a gathering of the tribes for a human being. This happened at the Golden Gate Park in January 1967, and he called that batch White Lightning. Money rolled in. Much of it was kept in $100 bills in safety deposit boxes at various banks around the United States, in London, and even Switzerland. How much? American banks had over $300,000 in 1967 dollars, which is about $3 million in today's money. No one really knows how much was stashed in London and Switzerland. There was an arrest or two, but Owsley managed to skate every time. That only added to his myth and legend. The stories spread about him were fantastic. He was something of a folk hero. One story had him visiting some activists in jail under the auspices of being some kind of religious leader. He apparently, allegedly, took with him a Bible with pages dipped in acid. Each of the prisoners tore out a page and ate it, tripping behind bars. It's not true, but it is a great story. Owsley's LSD and its effects on music began to spread at an exponential rate. The impact was incalculable, and we still haven't got to his impact on concert sound systems. We're going to cover all that next time on part 2 of this wild LSD story of Owsley Stanley and how he changed music forever with sound systems and his own brand of LSD. Meanwhile, you can catch up on all episodes of Uncharted by downloading them from your favorite podcast platform. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on this podcast, just shoot me an email, alan@alancross.ca. We can also meet up on all the social media sites, along with my website, ajournalofmusicalthings.com. It's updated with music news and recommendations every single day. And then there's the free daily newsletter that you should get. Stay ahead of your friends on what's going on in music. And please check out my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music at large. There are hundreds and hundreds of episodes that you can all enjoy for free. See you next time for part 2 of how Owsley's LSD changed concert sound and music. Trust me when I tell you, it's incredible. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.